Well, I am just delighted to be back here in the studio with you today because we have something new and fun to try. And first, I have to tell you, no, my robin drawing is not finished yet, but I have been working away on it, and I've sorted out my problem with the bricks. So stay tuned, and you'll be able to see it. I think it's a lot of fun to have a drawing going on the side, but as I've mentioned frequently, our real life sometimes gets in the way of getting long drawings done, which is why it's really fun to introduce you to all of these techniques and ways to go about getting into a drawing, whether you're going to work in it for a half hour, an hour, or many hours. So today, what we're going to be working on is toned paper, and this is using toned paper is a technique that I use to get into drawings quickly, and particularly when I only have a short amount of time. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and we can get started. And somebody has asked, can we use paper bags for the tone paper? Absolutely. Basically, and I'll talk a little bit about the paper itself, we're just looking for sort of a mid-range tone, and particularly for today, when we're just trying things out, whatever you have on hand will absolutely work. It's more about, having some kind of pencil and then something light, like a white charcoal pencil, a white colored pencil, or something like that, and you'll see why. So here we are back again for another summer of drawing. This is class number 4. And today, on the theme of home, we're going to be rockin' the porch. All right, so the concept of home. So I've been thinking a lot about, relaxation, not because I am, but because I would like to be relaxing. And, how how would I depict relaxing around the home in summer, a feeling of peace? So there are lots of things you can probably think of, all which would make an interesting composition depending on how you arranged it. Sitting in lawn chairs, the hammock, sitting on the front steps, depending on where you live, working on a project, maybe a car project that isn't actually a crucial one, gardening, barbecuing, all of those sorts of things. But for me, I was remembering back to, oh gosh, quite a long time ago in my mid-20s when I lived in a place where we had a couple of white uh, bentwood rockers out on the front porch. And I really loved those. I never actually got a chance to sit in those particular rocking chairs and read, but that was sort of always kind of the aspirational thing to do in the summertime. So I decided it would be fun to kind of create that, that looking back to that idea of the southern summer and sitting on the porch in the rocking chair and having a couple of books and something beside me, maybe a cup of coffee or something to drink. So um and I think we've got somebody who may need to be muted, either that or I've got a weird echo. Okay, so today we're going to be joining these two photos together into one composition. And we're really going to be concentrating on the picture that includes the rocking chair, but throwing in some books and something to drink perhaps beside it. Now, when I look at reference like this, I'm not looking to say, okay, I want these specific books. It has to be this specific cup. But I did pick a picture in this particular case that's kind of the same angle that we would be looking at, just to make it a little bit easier. So we'll be doing an upfront sketch like we did for the igloos, where we're going to combine these elements before we get started, just to sort of feel how that's going to go. And we're also going to make some decisions about how the background and stuff works. But before that, I want to talk about toned paper. And we're going to do an exercise that involves drawing something on toned paper that's pretty simple, just so you get the idea of how it works. Because I'm sure you're looking at this rocking chair right now and going, oh my goodness. All right, so one of the things that I've been doing this last over the winter and spring is doing these little going online to webcams, doing this travel art that basically takes an hour. This is all the time I have to do it in, so I'm working in a relatively small sketchbook, and I'm using this toned paper idea where I've just got graphite and a white charcoal pencil, and I'm trying to get the feeling of a scene. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at ourselves today, is how to get into a drawing like that and accomplish something in a relatively short amount of time. But of course, you can see with this technique, and you will as you go through it today, how you could then do a much, much more careful, longer drawing based on exactly the same technique and exactly the same sort of pathway in. So what we're going to start off today is our exercise is going to be drawing this little cup working on toned paper. Because what the first challenge I think is to get yourself away from the idea of what color am I looking at? So if you're thinking, "Oh my gosh, I should have green paper to do this." No, no, no. You can do this on any paper. Working on toned paper uses the paper as the local color. So if you've got blue paper or brown paper or whatever, you're just substituting, that becomes the color of the scene. And all you're worrying about are the darks and the lights. So this will make a lot more sense when we're actually doing it. But I wanted to show you, if you look down at the bottom, that kind of fan of papers, the mid-range values of papers are kind of those ones, not too dark, not too light, right in the middle there, blues, grays, tans. What you want really is a paper that's light enough to show pencil and dark enough to show either white charcoal pencil, white colored pencil, or some people even use white gouache or white watercolor to do the same technique. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to do this drawing faster than we would if we had to draw every shade out with a pencil. What we're doing instead is we're going to use the paper color for that entire mid-range. So if you look at the value scale there, you see I've got white charcoal pencil to represent the brightest stuff, and graphite or charcoal pencil to do the darkest stuff. And all that middle stuff is going to be done by the paper itself. So sometimes actually having to do this rather quickly works to your benefit because you really don't have time. You don't have time to mess with the middle stuff. If you just worry about the darks and the lights and the paper takes care of everything else for you, that's a really great way to get a drawing done relatively quickly. So when the process, and I'm going to show you how to do it, but we're just going to go through the steps first. Local color means the natural color of the object. So if it was a lemon, it would be yellow. In this case, we've got a spring green cup on an industrial green background. Those are the local colors. Basically, if you took out all of the light and all of the dark and you didn't have any kind of shading, those are the colors that you would have. What we're going to do is we're just going to worry about the lights and the darks in this scene. The steps that we'll go through there are 4 of them. We're going to very lightly draw in whatever it is, because we have just, it's nice to have a framework to start with. But we're going to keep the lines light because where the white charcoal or the white pencil comes down, we don't want it picking up too much of the graphite and making a gray mess, because that will happen. You'll get used to that over time, erasing and making sure the areas are clean where you want the brightest bits. But it's just a good way to start is just not having your initial lines too dark. Then squinting. Now, one of my friends here on the island who is an artist said that she doesn't like to squint because it might give her wrinkles. But I'm looking at this from my advanced age and thinking that that's just fine. We're going to go ahead and squint. So if you look at this and you do squint and get your lashes down and almost eliminate the color in the scene, you'll see some really distinct dark areas and some very distinct light areas as well. And that is all we're going to have to worry about. So we squint, we look for the darks, we draw those in first using whatever method we feel like. We add in the lights and the highlights. Then we go back and we see if we need to refine anything, make it neater, brighter, darker. And that's it. That's all there is to it. Now, when I say use any method you want, this is a really good time to use that beveled pencil technique to get a lot of graphite down quickly. And then just use a regularly sharpened charcoal pencil, just like you normally would for the white charcoal. And then what I do at the end for the refining part is I usually come back with regularly sharpened pencils, just, the normal conical point, or a mechanical pencil, because you'll find, especially when you work with toned paper, most of it is a bit rougher than what we're used to with the white paper. So when you're doing the beveled pencil, for example, it'll deposit graphite on top of the bumps, but not necessarily within them. And when you want to refine the drawing, it's good to come back in with a sharper point to kind of neaten everything up. You'll sort of see that as we go. So, okay, let's get ready to do some drawing. This is the very first thing I want you to do, just on a scrap of paper. If you've got some toned paper, just use a small bit. If you're using a paper bag, as someone suggested, that's a great way to give this a try. So what you're going to do first is just go into a drawing the way you normally would. You're going to draw the overall shape really lightly. I included that line at the back, just I thought it would give me a chance to use a little bit more darkness. And then I put the darks in first. So I did most of these darks using the beveled pencil, or actually a couple of beveled pencils. And the first thing I found out is that I can't start as light as we did, over the last few weeks. I can't start with a 4H or even a 2H. An H hardly shows up. So I started off with an HB pencil, and I did my main shading with the HB pencil. And then I went in with the 4B to do the darker stuff. And then I actually did go back to an H, a harder pencil, just to kind of get the stuff that was edging off to the side, getting a little bit lighter. Now, I might have even gone a little bit too far. As I was using the H pencil to do that kind of in the very middle of the cup as it gets towards the lighter point. As I was actually drawing that, I was thinking to myself, you know what? I really don't have to do this. This is part of the local color. But what the heck? I was already into it. And so I just, kept going. So I am actually, even though I know you're still working on this point, I am going to actually move on to showing you the next step. So you sort of understand how they all come together as you're drawing. So don't worry, I'll stay on this one for a while so you can see what's going on. So the step 3 is adding in the lights and the highlights, and then refining and stating the darks and lights as needed. So you see now, I think, how the color green, quote unquote, is really handled by the paper overall. It doesn't actually matter which green it is. Now, if I really wanted to show a difference between the darker part of kind of the wall in the background, of course, I could very lightly shade on top of my toned paper and get that other value. And likewise, I could get in there with a pencil and get much darker underneath the little cup and add in all kinds of refinements as I go. For this exercise, I didn't feel that was necessary. What I wanted to do instead, though, was do a couple of things which I knew would be interesting if I were ever to take this further, or just because they're kind of fun. One is when I do squint and I look at that cup, the bottom edge of the cup on the right-hand side, which is pretty dark, does sort of lose itself into the shadow. Sure, if we stare at it really hard, we start to see, pretty distinctly that there is an edge. But when you squint and you don't see that distinction, that actually works much better for an artistic piece like a painting or a drawing to have some of those lost edges, because it's really, when we just glance at something, that's how we see it. We usually aren't staring to the point where every last detail comes out. And I think that this is something that happens to artists in general. When they're looking at their photographic reference or even reference in life, you start to look too closely. You want to get up closely to that object and see what it looks like. But really if you're doing representational art, in general, you're representing what you see at some kind of distance rather than zoomed in, unless you're, doing that actually on purpose. So this idea of understanding how lost edges works can be really helpful. And likewise, when I went to do the lights and put the white part in, I noticed that really the lower corner on the left-hand side of the cup kind of does the same thing going the other direction. Sure, it's a little bit different in local color, a little bit different in value, but there's a point there where the two values sort of meet, the lightness of the table and then the lightness of the cup. So when I was drawing, you're probably, finding yourself in the same position as well. I got to a point where I wasn't quite sure what to do about the table. Is that a light or is that a dark? And this is when your artistic inclination just comes into play. And I decided, hey, I think it's light enough that I'd like to show it as being different from the rest of the background, the upper part. So I'm going to just very carefully put a little bit of the white charcoal down, just to sort of differentiate everything else. I thought it looked a little bit more balanced that way. And likewise, I had put a little bit of shading above that dark line in the dark, just for the same sort of thing. So when you're doing work like this on toned paper, your artistic expression absolutely comes in play. You decide how much of that white goes down, how much of the darks go down. This is one thing about, I think, when we talk about representational art, some people get pretty, forensic about it, and everything has to be in exact detail. And I think if what you end up with is something that's pleasing to you, even if it's just a 5-minute sketch, that's fine. And another thing I would like to absolutely point out before we go any further, because this applies a lot to people who are painting in particular. If you look at this little cup, you see below the ridge, there's kind of a bright reflected light under there. It looks really bright green. And then if you look down at the bottom of the cup, there's reflected light from the ground, basically, or from this table, that reflects up and puts a little rim of light around the bottom. It's difficult sometimes when you're drawing to know what to do with that. If you're doing something in colored paint, well, you just find a shade that's like that, and you can use that there. When you're drawing, there's a tendency to make that rim underneath lighter than it really appears. Whereas if you kind of squint and look at it, you see that it's not quite as light as the brighter whites. It's a little bit, but not so much. So that's where you as an artist can make that decision. So I decided I would show just a little stripe of the lighter using the charcoal, just a little bit, not going all the way around, but just a little bit at the front, at the upper and lower portion there, where underneath that rim at the top, and then at the bottom where there was a little reflected light. But I tried not to go further because the lightest, this is sort of one of those little things that you hear artists say, you want the lightest part of your dark area to still be darker than the lights, if that makes any sense. So, you had to be a little bit judicious. To begin with, once you start looking for lights, you find them everywhere. Sometimes you have to go back to squinting and see just how much do I need. And then when it comes to the charcoal pencil or whatever you're using, not to try to hold back from just filling the whole thing up with white. Everything now you've lost your local color of the paper completely because you've got darks meeting lights. Now, if you've done that, don't worry. It's such a common thing to do. And you'll see actually some artists do that on purpose. But what I'm trying to get you to do is stop earlier than that, and let the local color, let the paper act as the greens in this case to come through. Okay, now let's wrap this up and get on to the next stage so we can get into the actual drawing we're going to work on today. I'm going to keep you guys at a pace today, and I know it's going to be a little bit fast, but I just want to make sure we get all the way through these steps. We'll be doing work on toned paper 6 more times this summer. And because of having done these exercises and going through these steps, we'll be able to do the other 6 in a far more relaxed manner. So they're not all going to be at the pace that we're going to move today. So let's go back to our rocking chair, since we're rocking the porch for this particular class. So this is a very complicated scene, as you're probably realizing. There's a lot going on. You've got a complicated chair, lots of railings. You've got the actual porch itself, never mind adding in things from another image. So when you think about the concept, of home, relaxing on the porch, having a couple of books and a mug of coffee, none of those things require everything that's in this image to be in it. In fact, I actually decided to make my drawing a little bit more rustic, in part because I knew that I was working small, working on kind of rough paper, and that it would be difficult to get an overly smooth look anyway. So why even bother to do that? Also, the chair can be more simple. The railings behind the chair don't actually need to be there. We can just keep the railings on the right-hand side. That's perfectly fine. Not too sure yet about the porch floorboards, but how much of that do we need to show? But I think we do need a few of those plants peeking through the the railings, because that's kind of an interesting look. Otherwise, it would get a little too architectural. The background foliage, I think, is necessary because it gives us more of that feeling of summer. And then we're going to add in books and a drink. So once those decisions have been made, and also realizing that we can keep the focal point right around the chair. You know, we don't actually have to have all of this rectangle of image in there. We can reduce the number of railings we have just to 5 or 6. There'll be none in the back. And all of a sudden, this scene starts to be a little bit more simple. So if we also look at what we're going to add into the scene, you know, we don't have to be exact about which books or that sort of thing. I did decide after looking at this, I'm like, okay, well, if it's me, I don't actually drink tea like that in a saucer. I actually drink mugs of things, mugs of coffee and mugs of tea. So I decided right here, even though this was a lovely picture, I was going to put a mug in mine, easier to draw as well. And the other thing I did like was I liked the variety of size of book, a big, maybe a big and a small, thin or thick. So these things are all I wanted to add to the scene. I could put more stuff in if I wanted to, but in terms of my story of relaxing on the porch, this would be all I need. So we're going to go back to that idea that we did with the igloo, which is before we even get to a no-tan stage, we're going to do a rough sketch, just to figure out how are we going to integrate those ideas we just had of things to eliminate, and putting these the books and a mug perhaps in the picture. But I want to do this particular rough sketch on toned paper rather than doing it on white paper, because this starts to give us the idea of where are our lights and darks going to go. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on this. How much am I going to give you? About 4 minutes to work on this. So I'm going to keep an eye on the time, and continue to sort of talk about some of this. So it has been very important for me during the course of figuring out these classes for you to definitely show you how I actually work, as well as kind of like these are the steps you can take. So this idea of a rough sketch being just this rough, this is exactly how I do it. I would not take it I would have spent, you know, what, just like you are, 4 or 5 minutes on this, and that would be enough, because during this time, I'm observing the scene, I'm simplifying it to the point where I'm like, okay, there's, you know, I don't know how many rails are on the back of that chair. I definitely don't need all of them. Do I need 3? Do I need 4? I'm not quite sure, but you know, that's something to consider. Do I need every single one of the rails around the bottom to hold the legs together? No, I don't think so. I can probably take half of those out to simplify the scene. Do I need to show every single indentation between the planks on the floor? Probably not. Probably just a few. First, I tried it with none. That wasn't as interesting. So I put a couple back in and we'll sort of see how it goes. But I did also notice the things I really did like. I liked this odd shape that is made by the light going through the railings and the way there's a little bit of a shadow at the top. I like the fact that the chair is lit from 2 different sides so that I can see the form of the rocking chair without having to color it in with a white pencil. Because if I did that, I wouldn't get that feeling of 3 dimension. So that's another sort of kind of important point to note. And then I had to start thinking, and we'll get to you know, really how to carry that out. I had to start thinking about the light and the shadow and what to do with that, how to work that a little bit further. So I'll give you just a couple more minutes on this particular part. Just keep it rough. I think one of the more difficult parts is really there are a lot of crazy angles in here. And as you start to draw this today, your rocking chair is going to have an interesting shape to it, most likely, because every single angle on that rocking chair, on those railings, and on the floor, they're all different. So our eye level in this picture is about mid height on the railings, a little bit below the arm rests, a little bit above the seat. So that means not only are these angles shooting off into different areas in space based on the form of the rocking chair, which is not straight upright, but also we've got every other angle going off in a different direction as well. And that means when you draw something like this is really when that business of holding your pencil up, checking the angle on the image, and then holding it still, going back to your page and double checking is really important. Um, what I do is I get my rough sketch in the right direction to start with, knowing that I'm going to pay, whatever started causing me trouble right here at this stage is definitely going to cause me trouble as I get into the drawing. So this is sort of a little bit of a preparation. So the next step that we go to then is the notan. And now this is the way that I realistically, in real life, do a notan at this point on toned paper. I don't do a separate drawing. I will often, on toned paper like this, just add my darks in on top of this. And so that's what we're going to do today. So rather than redrawing the whole thing, and sometimes, for an overall larger picture, you do want to sort out the design work and the lights and darks. In this particular case, we already know what our composition is and where we're going with this, but we do need to sort out what the dark pattern is. So go ahead and take just a couple of minutes to sketch in where you would like to have your darks. When I'm doing something like this, I'm trying to figure out not only kind of, what's an overall kind of spread of darks that would look nice and take your eye around. I'm also starting to figure out, okay, if the light's coming in from two different directions, and I've just added 3 imaginary objects in, what does that mean about how the light will fall on them? Well, some light will come from one direction, some from the other. I look underneath the rocking chair and I see kind of where the bigger shadows are, where the larger areas of dark, because we don't have a lot of them on the porch. And then I emulate those over on the book, knowing that as we actually do the sketch that I'll refine all of this. But I also start to see something that I know will be extremely useful when I'm drawing the actual drawing. And that is that the darks, for example, behind the rails on the chair and some of the other parts basically in that scene, those darks are going to help me define my edges in the actual drawing, which will do half of my work for me. Sure, I'm probably going to sketch out how those rails go, but I don't have to be super exact because the exact part can come when we do the darks. And I'll show you how that works. All right, we're going to one more minute on this part, and then we're going to move into starting our actual sketch. One thing you'll also notice is I'm going to work on a different colored paper for the sketch than for this. I love toned paper. I draw on it all the time. I think it's fun. I love the bit when you add in the whites and you just sort of see the thing come together. So I have lots and lots and lots of midtones of gray, of blue, of beiges, odd kind of colors. I like the speckled paper, but I find it can sometimes interfere with the, just because I tend to draw not really large, sometimes those speckles get in the way. So that's something that I notice. I work on the smooth side if there's a smooth and a rough side. Some people really prefer to work much larger and they like the roughness. They like that texture that's added in. So it's definitely something to play around with. For these classes, I'm keeping my drawings small just so that we get through them in the time frame. And I am using the smoother side, but that still has a certain amount of texture to it, as you can see. All right. So where we're going to go today is we're going to end up, this is where I ended up, the blue image over here. And that was sort of my rustic drawing that I ended up with in about the same time frame that I'm giving you, which is about 25 minutes to get there. A lot of time was spent figuring out what these angles were to at least get me in the right ballpark. And I kept my eye on my initial sketch and my notan, where I kind of beefed everything up as I went along. So let's get started on the very first step in this. So the first step, and I'm going to show you just like I did last week, I'm going to show you my sketch larger, talk about it for a minute, and then show you my sketch smaller so you can see the reference properly without it being obfuscated like this. So for the tone paper, excuse me, I find starting with a medium pencil, like an H or an HB, is the best way to sketch your lines initially. If you start with something like a 2H or a 4H, it might make a little bit more of an indentation in the paper than you want, because you will definitely be wanting to erase a lot of the lines you put down initially. But also, it's really hard to see. So I find that I put down just enough lines to get myself going with the idea that I'm going to be refining and erasing a lot of those lines that overlap each other and aren't too neat as I go along. So let me move to the part where you can actually see a little bit more clearly your reference material. Now, I am not going to show you the reference material of the books and the mug as we go. I'm going to be relying on you and your memory, putting those in. Now, you can either use my sketch kind of as reference or just sort of put some placeholders in there. And I know that might be a little bit stressful, but these are objects that we have seen for most of our lives, cups, mugs, and books. And the exercise of trying to figure out what that would look like and where they should go is a really good use of your imagination and your memory at this point. And because this drawing that we do, right here in class, I'm sure that if you want to tackle this subject again, you would want more than the time I'm going to give you to do the drawing in. You will be able to look at the reference that'll come around in the PDF, and you will be able to draw a little bit more closely. But you'll find even then that those images in the photo reference aren't at exactly the angles that you need. And even here, when I did this one, the fatter book, I was like, I haven't quite got that right. I'm not quite sure what's wrong with it, but it also isn't quite where it needs to be. But I decided that's fine. I've got it basically where I want it. And as we go along from step to step, I can sort of figure that out. So I'm going to keep you guys on. We're going to spend about 7 minutes per step for 4 steps to get you through this. So about 4 more minutes on this one. Now, this is where, I think the stress really kind of comes in, because as you're starting to make decisions about what you're going to keep in and what you're going to keep out on that rocking chair, there's a lot there. I would make your rocking chair as simple as you possibly can. If that means 1 slat at the back, rather than 2, if it means, 3 rails instead of 6, if it means you're not even bothering to join up the legs with anything at all, that's fine. And likewise, so what I did for the porch planks to figure out how those should go is I took my pencil and I looked at that angle where the planks meet, that V that they make going up towards the corner. And I drew that line first, the one that goes from the basically upper right to the lower left. And I just lightly sketched that in. And I figured if I wanted to include any of these planks, these porch planks at all, that I would need that line there anyway, and that would give me something to go from. And I also kind of, I wasn't quite sure what kind of plants, right, am I drawing here? And I realized that doesn't matter. All I need is sort of plant-like looking stuff, looking a little bit fluffy, having a little bit of a shape to it. And what was more important, that I started setting myself up for where the lights and the darks would be. Likewise, my railing is not the same height as the railing in the image. I decided to make mine a little bit lower down. I think I adjusted that up a little bit as I went, but I can't remember. But once again, this is not a drawing of railings, right? This is a drawing that's really about the chair, the books, kind of a rustic feeling. And it was important for me not to start leading myself down the path that I know I will go on, which is trying to put in every single architectural detail. So on purpose, I was like, okay, I'm going to show only 4 or 5 railings. I'm going to minimize that entire structure. I'm going to keep the attention a little bit more over here on the chair. So 1 more minute on this stage. You'll still be able to work on this, because as we go to the next step, you'll still be refining your drawing. This is really just like the basic schematic that we're going to use to go from. So as I mentioned before, I find with toned paper, one of the wonderful things about it is as you do each next step, you can clean up anything that you didn't do quite right in the step before. And then you can use your darks and your lights to create edges, because the color of the thing, whether it's the white chair or the green vase or whatever, the color of the thing is made by the paper. Even though this is a white chair, we are not going to color it all white. We're just going to worry about where the light hits it, those rim lights that we see along the edge. So let's move to the next stage. So the next step is adding in the darks. For this, I used my beveled pencil. I used, I think it was I don't know if I started off with the HB. I might have started with the HB, and then I definitely moved to the 4B. I went straight for the darks because I needed darks that were dark enough with this tone paper to really show up. I didn't, for this particular sketch, I didn't need to ease into it. So I did as I was going around adding in darks was I was like, I put too many rails in the back of that chair. I'm going to make it only 4. So I erased what I had and then sketched back in 4 rails. And then as I drew the dark of the background, I started to neaten up how those rails looked. For the foliage stuff that was going on the background, I just started thinking about that same thing I told you guys about texture last week. I started thinking about what what does what does this foliage feel like? What are these clumps of foliage? They're sort of bending off to the side. There's a little bit of movement. They're not all going in the same direction. They kind of trail off to the edges. And then I did the same thing looking for the darks in other places. What I didn't do was I didn't start doing a lot of detail and refinement right here because I know I'll get to that at the very, very end. All I'm doing is establishing the darks and trying to neaten up a little bit what else was going on. So what else did I add in? I did the darks for the shadows underneath the chair rockers. I added in the darks for the books and for the cup. I kind of changed a little bit how I wanted the book to look. I'm still not sure that was right, but that's how it's going to be. And I kind of imagined some lost edges around the book leading up to the cup, just to kind of make a little vignette of objects that sort of were sorted together. Now, moving over to the railing and also that column there, I noticed that the column on the left side on the right side got a little bit darker as it went up. So I said, that's kind of interesting because that sort of anchors in the darks in the background. It kind of pulls it in, even though in the image they're not as dark. It's still kind of a useful little device I can throw in there. And then with the foliage coming through, I didn't worry about drawing exactly this foliage. I decided just once again to kind of think about what foliage kind of feels like coming through there and do some shapes, knowing that I will be refining this with lights and refining it with a finer pencil as we go along. So just take some time to continue to work on this for about 4 more minutes. And then we'll move on to, there's always a favorite fun stage for me. And for me, the favorite fun stage is adding in the lights. So you might be worrying right now about like how your light's going to go in there. You can see how sketchy my chair still looks. I've got rails all over the place. I've moved a few around at this point. I erased things and put a few things in, but you can see a lot of my lines coming through other lines. And that is because I know that using the kneaded rubber eraser and shaping it into a pretty fine edge, that I'm going to be able to clean those up before I get to the point of putting in the whites. I'm just going to mute myself for a second and take some tea because I can tell I'm losing my voice today. All right, that's much better. Now, if you're ever doing a far more finished drawing, and you might have, if you went to the Martha's Vineyard Drawing Prize website, you probably saw some artwork that just blew your mind when it came to drawing. And those are people who definitely have taken these techniques and have worked up drawings that have taken them hours and hours and hours to do. And you can get to that point and do that sort of work, the more familiar you get with these styles. I now, over many years, have kind of a bucket of different techniques I can use depending on how much time I have available and what I'm trying to work with. I think it's difficult to launch yourself into a project that you know is going to take you, 20 hours or so, without having gone through an awful lot of these earlier stages, working out how can I do some of the shortcuts? Like, is there a way for me to get a little bit faster to the end of that and still achieve what I want? And also, which are the parts where I really love so much to take a lot of time on and really work the details out? I think, for if I were doing this as a more finished drawing, I'd spend a lot more time on the chair. Maybe I'd even work out a chair that was kind of unique, didn't even look like this one. The ones I remember from my past were, the bentwood rocker, the kind of the hickory rocker look, that weren't quite so, the turned wood. Maybe that would be a more interesting way to go about it. But I think that these, doing drawings like this, even if you never got beyond this, even if this was the drawing that you did, it still somehow encapsulates that feeling of home, that feeling of relaxation, even if it is a rustic drawing rather than a super finished drawing. The decision on where you stop on this stuff is entirely up to you. All right, just a couple more minutes on this stage, and then we'll move on to adding in the whites, my favorite part. Once again, if you can avoid coloring everything in, if you can just keep your darks to the dark, and if you feel like you've gone too far and maybe started coloring in too much stuff, you can erase it. That's what those wonderful tools are for. I love erasers. I don't know about you, but I remember like art classes years ago, like high school, we were sort of dissuaded from using an eraser. And I never realized for the longest time what a wonderful tool it was. I also should mention that this is a really good approach for people who are, if you're painting, there's sort of a method called grisaille, which involves doing exactly this, but in paint, where you work out the entire painting basically in darks and lights underneath the color, and then just work glazes of color or even thicker color in on top, but having the framework already decided. And if you're a person like me who likes drawing, I don't usually go to quite that extent. I will do like an oil drawing underneath on a toned background and then pick out the highlights with a rag rather than doing it in white. But it kind of gives you that sense of structure and a form of your painting before you get any further. And I think that's so much fun. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next step. Oops. Okay, there we go. Oh, I just realized I didn't give you the little picture, did I? Okay, I am so sorry about that. I got carried away. Okay, I'll do that this time. It was because I had eliminated the extra rails in my own drawing, so I was like, oh, why do you need those? Okay, this is the stage where we squint again and we look at the lightest areas and the highlights and start drawing those in. The big temptation is going to be avoiding making that a white chair, making those railings completely white, and trying to just let local color work. Now, I don't have in this stage all of the whites I'm going to eventually put in the railings added in, and all the whites I'm going to put everywhere. But what I am doing is I'm getting the basic whites in there. I'm seeing that there's a rim light that comes from both sides that affects many, but not all of the chair legs, and likewise of the back. So I'm being a little bit cautious how much white I put down at this stage. I know I'm going to add more in, and I know everything's going to get a lot neater as I go along. The other thing I'm doing is as I go along, for example, the upper left hand uh, um, upright of the chair, I erased completely my graphite lines and decided to try to show the shape of that just with the white pencil. So you can do that wherever you want to as you go along. I did a lot of cleaning up with my eraser before putting down the white so that I wouldn't just end up with kind of a greasy gray mess, which will happen. And, when it does, sometimes it's actually something you want to incorporate, but most of the time it isn't. Let me move on to when you can see the picture complete. There we go. That's what I should have done last time. Okay, so you can see from viewing it smaller in particular how I'm kind of dabbing in, going, all right, it's time to get some highlights in there, but I don't want to start coloring all over the place. I do have my pencil sharpened pretty well. I find when I do this at this particular stage, it's nice to have a sharper pencil. So although I used the beveled end pencils to get those darks in really quickly and kind of get that whole feeling worked out, when it comes to the whites, typically for anything that's going to end up being detail, I want to control where it's going. I don't want to start, coloring all over the place. Now, this is absolutely pretty rough because I'm probably working about 6 inches by 6 inches. In order to do this, I have the texture of the paper, and of course, charcoal pencil, even the white charcoal pencil, does not lay down, it lays down in kind of a flaky way, I guess you would say it, on the page, rather than a smooth way like, like a very fine graphite tip. And so knowing all of these things, just from having, worked doing this kind of stuff for a while, I know to be a little bit on the cautious side at this stage and just sort of start figuring out, where is the light hitting? Can I start to feel the form of the scene? Where are my brightest whites in particular going to be? And this is going to direct me when it comes to refining the darks again, which is the next step. Step 4 is sort of going back to the darks, going back to the lights, neatening everything up, adding a little bit more stuff here and there. This will tell me where I actually need to do the extra darks, because now I've got my 3 areas of value established. I've got my darks, I've got my paper, which is all those local colors, and I've got the white highlights. Because if you look at this white chair now, you probably see something, almost an optical illusion, that you didn't see before, and that is that the chair isn't white. It's actually kind of a yellowy, greeny gray in terms of like what color are we actually seeing in this image. I mean, we know mentally, right? We know this is a white chair. But what we actually see in this image is all of this reflected light from the gray coming up from the porch, the greens and yellow greens that are coming in, and all of that light bouncing around within the porch and hitting this chair, which is in shadow, but picking up all of this reflected color. And so this is why the technique of doing toned paper with graphite and a white of some sort works so well, because often what we are seeing is not actually a white object, but what we're seeing is light hitting a white object in such a way that some areas are whiter than others. And by showing that on the toned paper, we start to get this sense of form. Now, I'm going to move, even though I haven't given you a full 7 minutes on this stage, I'm going to move you to the last stage, just so you sort of see where we're going and you can kind of work it all in together as we go there. So this was my last stage, because this is about where I got to in the amount of time, 25 minutes that I gave myself to do it. And what I've done at this point is I've gone back into the darker areas with my mechanical pencil. I didn't use the beveled edge again. And I started adding in some kind of textural lines of what, a little bit of stuff going off the edge of what I thought kind of looked foliage like, over on the right and into the background. I neatened up my edges going around the railings on the back of the rocking chair. I figured out what I was going to do with the seat, because that had been kind of bothering me, and I sort of left it to last. So I kind of did a little bit of shading under there. I just added a little bit more stuff to my books. I'm still not sure I've got my perspective just right, but I figured that's how they're going to be. And I added a little bit of coffee in my cup and a little bit of the dark that I felt I needed to show the light. And I also just sort of neatened up my flowers and stuff over that were coming through the railings. I didn't want to go too far on that because I really didn't want them to take away from the attention that the whites had put on the chair, the books, and the cup. But I did start adding in a little bit more of that light that comes through the railings, just so that could be seen. I brightened up whites in various different places, and I threw a little bit of white in the background just to offset the foliage and make that look a little bit more, so you could see the foliage pattern. Let me move this so that you can get that out of the way so you can see the whole scene again. So you're probably finding, as I did, that I was like, wow, I could spend a lot more time on this. And I could really, double check. I eliminated, some of those railings around the bottom of the chair and move them. And I'm like, maybe some of those have to come back in on a later iteration. I'm not quite sure. Like, do I need them from a design point of view? I couldn't quite tell. I liked the height of my railings, but I realized I probably angled my top railing upwards a little bit because I had checked my angle based on the angle it was at a higher level. And I just moved that down without adjusting a little bit for the perspective. So, and this is a sort of thing that you only notice when you finish the drawing. But I'm just going to leave it like it is. It's a good a good practice piece. And I think what I would do if I were to draw this again, well, of course, I would adjust that. I would figure out a little bit more what to do underneath the rocking chair. And I probably would set up a little pile of excuse me, a little pile of books and a cup, kind of at the distance and angle away that this rocking chair is. And just, I'm like, okay, that's not too bad from memory, but it's not as exact as if I would want it to be if I was going to spend 20 hours on a drawing. I would want to have that stuff just so. But for this little drawing, I'm fine because I feel like it captures that rustic feeling of sitting on a porch, reading a book. Summer's going on, foliage is growing at large, and I am not out there neatening it all up. Instead, I've been reading and doing something much more relaxing. So that's, as I said, aspirational. My summer hasn't quite got to that point yet. I'm not sure if yours has, but it's something to look forward to. And I also wanted to mention that for those of you who like smudging things and blending and all of that, and have some of those blending stumps. Um, it is perfectly fine, and it's a really wonderful technique actually to use with toned paper to do a little bit of smudging here and there in the early stages in particular to kind of establish those darker tones and then come in at the end like we are here with more of the textural lines on top. So rather than overly smudging everything out and making it too soft, it's nice to do a little bit of that to get some of your darks in there and then come back with a bit of texture. Likewise, I sometimes find in those little travel sketches I was doing for the sky, I would put down the white charcoal and then with my finger or just a Q-tip, I would soften it, except for in the brighter, more highlight place, where I might even go back with a second application of the white charcoal just to get it a little bit more dense. That way, your background isn't really competing with the more interesting stuff in the foreground. And as we go, I think I'm not sure if it's next class, but definitely the one after, I'm going to be doing a lot more with, blending and using these blending stumps and that kind of thing. So if you've never used them before, not quite sure, you don't have to try it yet. That's something that we'll definitely be getting into. All right, one more minute just to kind of wrap this up, and then we'll go over to a little bit of a review. I know that this was a lot to not only work from two different images or two different ideas, but eliminate an awful lot of the drawing of the image that you're looking at, and make modifications on the fly while learning a new technique. But I think that the confidence to be able to do this, to realize you can, yeah, okay, the first attempt may not always go as smoothly as you would like. It might take a while. I mean, I've been doing using toned paper for ages. And a lot of my sketches are just this rustic, because it's fun to me. It's a fun way to draw. Everything doesn't have to, be something that you want to put in a museum. I just like the whole opportunity, I think, to, look more carefully at objects, to know a little bit more about them. Once you've drawn a rocking chair and realized how they're constructed and all the work that has to go into making a rocking chair, you know, beautifully balanced, both for actual functional use, but also, as an object in itself, then, every time you see a rocking chair from now on, you'll have a much greater appreciation of that, of how the light hits it, whether it's red, black, brown, white, whatever color it is. Likewise, railings. Once you see how light comes through railings and you've actually tried to draw them and use the white charcoal to represent the light, I think it gives you a better appreciation when you're drawing, even ones that are, unfinished wood or whatever. What are you looking for? Where's the variation there in the light and dark patterns? Okay, everybody, wrap that up and we'll just finish off for today. So just to review, when it comes to the concept, and we're following this concept of home, you want to tell your own story. So for me, there was this story I had, this memory of these chairs, and kind of an aspirational living idea that one day I'm going to be sitting, at least hopefully this summer, reading a couple of books with a cup of coffee, outside in a comfortable chair. And I have a funny story to tell you since you've made it through all of this. So those particular rockers I talked about years ago were out on my porch, and somebody stole them one day. Two people evidently stole them. What happened was, and this is what we got them back again. What happened was the people across the way said, I saw somebody taking, two men with your rocking chairs on their heads upside down, carrying those rocking chairs down the railway track near where I lived. And I was like, that is the craziest thing. And a neighbor wanted to know, was this someone we knew? And I was like, no. So she said, well, they went that way down the track. So we went down the track as well, trying to see what would happen, hoping a train wasn't going to come along, and actually found our chairs stuffed under an embankment. Now, I don't know whether these fellows thought that was a great idea, a place that they would come back to, and they had these rocking chairs, or whether a train had come along and they had to ditch them. All I know is that the rocking chairs came home, and this time had very sort of surreptitious chains attached to them so they wouldn't take a walkabout again. So not only was the idea of doing these rocking chairs, something to do with the concept of home, it also brought up a fun memory for me from way back. And I think this is what's important about drawing and what we decide to draw is not necessarily for impressing the crowds, but to tell our own story and to bring in things like that, stuff that was fun or something that we have a memory from way back. We don't have to worry whether it's universal, although I'm sure a lot of people looking at a rocking chair and books and a mug on the porch would understand precisely what I was trying to get across. But it's just that idea that, if we do something that does mean something to us, someone else out there is probably, has a similar, maybe not exactly the same memory, but something similar. Also, do that rough sketch. If you're going to use more than one reference image, just take a few minutes, put them together, especially if you're adding items from your imagination. Don't just wait till you get to the big drawing. And don't skip the notan, even if you're just doing it like I do, kind of quasi notan, adding your darks into your little rough so you know where you're going. So just a quick review of the technique. When you're using toned paper, very useful to squint to get all of that information about what color you're looking at out of your head. Just look at the lights and the darks. Get those darks in first, come in with some of those lights. You can refine your edges and stuff as you go. Everything doesn't have to be planned out perfectly from the start. And then that last stage is to go back, look at the lights and look at the darks, refine your edges, come in with a more narrow pencil. Like I like to use the mechanical pencil a lot for that, just to neaten things up. Punch out those brights, get those darks in there that you want to have, and boom, you're done. You don't want to cover the entire toned paper with mid-tone pencil, because that will completely defeat the purpose. And then as you become familiar with this technique, and as we go through the summer and do the other 6 subject matter the same way when we have more time, that's when it's time to start bringing in these other concepts, varying the pencil strokes, using beveled pencils and not beveled pencils together, changing the length of the stroke, hatching, all of that kind of thing. And also thinking about textures while you're drawing them, what requires smoothness, what requires roughness, and all of that kind of thing. Okay, folks, that was a really great introduction to drawing on toned paper. I'm going to stop screen sharing. And hopefully you survived that. This is definitely one of my favorite ways to draw, but I know it can be a little bit unusual. If you're used to using white paper and approaching from that point of view, it's sort of difficult to get the idea out of your head that you have to do anything with those midtones, which usually on white paper, you spend a great deal of time worrying about. So I hope that this is something that you get a chance to practice. I'll send around this PDF afterwards and you can give that a shot again. Or you might have something else that you just want to draw around your own home. Do that squinting thing. It'll tell you where to go from the start.